The party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, tried to play both sides of the debate over leaving the European Union. Now, that productive ambiguity is tearing Labour apart. Wolverhampton, England. To understand the contradictions that are tearing the Labour Party apart, consider Ruth Wilkinson and Philip Handley, both Labour supporters. Ms. Wilkinson, 24, voted for Britain to remain in the European Union. Mr. Handley, 60, to leave. The only bond that unites them is their fury at Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, and his handling of the opposition to the government's plan for Britain's departure from the European Union, known as Brexit. Both are ready to ditch the party altogether. "I'm absolutely devastated about the direction we're travelling in," Ms. Wilkinson, who works for a charity, said. "The party that I hold dear, and the party that I would stand behind, is not doing anything to offer a solution or an alternative." Mr. Handley said Labour had misled people like him. "I've always voted for the Labour Party," said the retired transport manager, who would prefer that Britain leave the bloc with no deal. "But this is the only thing I disagree with Jeremy Corbyn, how he handles Brexit." 18 months ago, Mr. Corbyn, 69, a longtime Labour outsider cast as a kind of far-left revolutionary, was riding a wave of popularity. Labour had far exceeded modest expectations in a 2017 snap general election, and Mr. Corbyn had emerged as a surprisingly appealing figure, with young people memorably chanting his name at a music festival. He was seemingly primed to capitalise on the Conservatives' infighting and missteps over the exit negotiations. Instead, he is now openly at war with his own members of parliament, 9 of whom have defected in the space of 2 weeks. And the party is bleeding both Remain and Leave voters, while facing serious accusations of institutional anti-Semitism. There is talk of an existential threat. Labour's crisis is much deeper than earlier crises, said Mark Leonard, director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. There is a standoff between the party and the country, the party and parliament, and it's difficult to see how you could cut your way through it. Brexit has proved to be politically lethal. Rather than pitting left against right, or the government against the opposition, it cuts across ideological lines, eating away at the cohesion of Britain's largest parties, the Conservatives and Labour. But Labour faces even broader forces. In recent years, centre-left, socialist-leaning parties across Europe have been fragmenting under an onslaught of right-wing populist parties catering to a broad swath of voters, older working classes and younger, urban people, loaded down with student debt. Labour had seemed to be bucking that trend, but now is scrambling to avoid a devastating split. Much of the blame, fairly or not, falls on Mr. Corbyn. From the beginning of the Brexit debate, he has sought to lie low, content to criticise Prime Minister Theresa May while placating the main Labour constituencies, urban Remain voters and Leave supporters in rural areas or working communities, who make up about a third of the party's electorate. But as the Brexit deadline draws near, his efforts to appeal to both sides seem to be inflaming tensions rather than soothing them. Labour is running the risk of trying to compromise in several directions and antagonising everyone, said Robert Ford, professor of politics at the University of Manchester. Even after suffering a string of setbacks and humiliations, Mrs. May is still seen as the more capable leader, and the Tories consistently outpoll Labour in opinion surveys. Mr. Corbyn, never popular with the majority of his own Labour lawmakers, has suffered a slump in his personal ratings. The right-leaning Sunday Times recently claimed that 150,000 Labour members have already ditched the party over Mr. Corbyn's position on Brexit, a number the party vigorously denies. But there is no denying the defection of 8 Labour members of Parliament, who left last month to form the Independent Group, citing Mr. Corbyn's ambivalence over Brexit and his handling of anti-Semitism inside Labour. Another lawmaker left, too, though that was because he supported Brexit and said he was disaffected by Mr. Corbyn's leadership. What we're seeing now is that a series of deep divides, both recent and more long-standing, are coming out in the open, because a tipping point has been reached for many, said Mr. Ford of the University of Manchester. Mr. Corbyn moved quickly to staunch the rebellion, announcing that he would support a second referendum in the event of a Tory Brexit. But that seemed sure to anger Labour's Remain voters. Labour has always been divided between a moderate, internationalist, social democratic left, and a radical, pacifist anti-imperialist left. But the moderate side of the party has basically nearly always won. Mr. Ford said. Corbyn was the first time, probably since the 1930s, that the radical side of the party was in charge, and the rest of the party really doesn't really like that, especially the members of parliament. Mr. Corbyn himself embodies some of these contradictions. A lifelong Eurosceptic, he only grudgingly campaigned for Britain to remain in Europe during the 2016 referendum.